Kia ora and welcome to Ancestor at a Time, a very special live stream today for Waitangi Day. If you're not in New Zealand, Waitangi Day is our national day. It is the commemoration of this year, the 186th anniversary of the signing of our foundational document, Te Tiriti or Waitangi, also known as the Treaty of Waitangi. And we're a small country, but we have a lot of history, and I think that's true of every small country. I think the size of the country doesn't change the layers upon layers of things that happen and interpretations of what happened. So this is so right now, today, it's a public holiday in Aotearoa, New Zealand. I can actually hear snatches of music from our local park, Pā's Park, which is not super close. It's about 5 kilometers from here, but there's a concert there, Waitangi at Waititi, because the marae, which is the Māori meeting house, there is called Hoani Waititi Marae, and they're putting on a massive concert for those who can't go up to Waitangi to be there at the commemorations today. So anyway, party atmosphere over there. I'm at home being reflective, which is a good thing to do because it's a very there's a lot of thoughts about Waitangi Day, and it sort of depends who you ask. And there were the most shallow comments I've read today were, "Oh, it's just a day off work. It's a day to celebrate our country," that sort of thing. But for a lot of people, especially Māori people, it's commemoration, not celebration. Because, well, I'll tell you a little bit about it if you like to hear me. And this, again, a bit of a disclaimer, this is just my personal perspective and my personal experience. And since this is a channel about ancestors, it is going to be a little bit centered around my ancestors and my connection. So, as I mentioned, it's 186 years since the signing of Te Tiriti o Waitangi on the 6th of February 1840 at Waitangi in Northland. At about the same time, my ancestors, Thomas Urquhart McKenzie and his future wife, Margaret Fraser, were in the very early stages of setting up home halfway across the world from their original home in Scotland, in Inverness and Aberdeen. Inverness for Margaret and Aberdeen for Thomas. He got around different parts of Scotland. He was about 20 or 21 years old. No, sorry, 20. Yeah, he was a young man. And Margaret was with her whole family, the Frasers, who had come out a few months after Thomas. And he helped her ashore. He carried her ashore. And his friends noted that she was a bonny lass, only about 14 at the time. But he jokingly said, "I will marry her one day," and he did. So cute story. It was a meet cute. I think that's what the young people call it these days, a meet cute, on the ship in what was then called Port Nicholson, is now called Wellington, and is the capital of New Zealand. But yeah, back then it was. It was just a brand new settlement. It was a commercial settlement. So a couple of things were happening in 1840. There was the British government, which there were different voices within the British government. Queen Victoria had just recently, 3 years ago, begun to rule. And there were a bunch of different influences going on in British colonization at the time. And so often these days we tend to look at colonization as one single evil thing. And it's true, it was evil in its consequences, and we'll perhaps get more into that later. But the intentions were many and varied. There was naked greed, there was corruption, there was also evangelicalism, and I touched on this in last week's one about the East India Company. Evangelicalism was a double-edged sword. On the one hand, there was this really strong human rights influence, the likes of William Wilberforce, the likes of bringing an end to slavery, despite its economic consequences, because some things were more important than money. And so some of those early evangelicals, they dared to make that happen. At the same time, there was still a sense of religious superiority and cultural superiority that meshed together. So many missionaries tied Christianity to what they called civilization. Was it civilization? That's debatable. But that was the approach of the early missionaries in New Zealand. They came to first civilize, then Christianize, because the intentions may have been good, but the outcomes were not. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's stick to my family, the McKenzies. So Thomas and Margaret, they would get married a few years later, still when she was way too young by today's standards. But anyway, and let me I've got a little photo of them here, and I just want to share it with you because these are my people. Goodness me, just getting my desktop cleared. There we go. Hello, McKenzies. So as I said, they started in Port Nicholson, otherwise known as Porneke, and then which became known as Wellington. This is Thomas Urquhart McKenzie, variously described by his grandsons as a terrifying man. He was a Scottish, gruff, brutal man. Sometimes you didn't want to get into an argument with him, but also known for being very tender and devoted to his wife. And also he was a gardener. So he had been a gardener in Scotland, and he put his skills to good use when he came here to Aotearoa. They started in Kaiwharawhara, which is just north of Wellington. Then they moved to Porirua, which is a little bit further north. And then in 1855, after a massive earthquake that shook the whole lower South Island, they moved to the place that they would eventually settle in, which is known as Rangatira. Now, there's a double connection with my family on both sides. So the very place where they lived in Rangatira then later became Flock House, where my father's father first came to New Zealand. So that place, that part of Aotearoa is very special to me. So the McKenzies, what must have they been thinking at the time that Te Tiriti was being signed? And I need to research more about this because they didn't write anything about it. They wrote more about, so his daughter Eliza wrote an awful lot about what life was like growing up. She was an amazing woman. She was one of the first, and at the time she died in 1937, she was the oldest white woman who was born in New Zealand. And so, yeah, she was born in 1843. And so her diaries, I will be incorporating them into future episodes of One Ancestor at a time because it's such a real taonga or treasure to have her insights. But she didn't ask the questions that we might ask were we able to directly ask her. But she was a formidable woman. She grew up of necessity quadrilingual, 4 languages. So Gaelic, which her parents spoke and her grandparents, English, which everyone spoke, and it was kind of the lingua franca, which is ironic that a Latin word that means French should mean English. Anyway, lingua franca, like the common language that's spoken by everybody and is used for getting around. But also she had to learn Te Reo Māori because in those days, in the 1840s and 50s, the number of Māori far outweighed the number of Pākehā. And so just to do business, to trade, to learn about the place where you live and are growing up, you had to know Te Reo Māori. And it was really great to meet a fellow descendant of Eliza and hear that one of her sons was very passionate about teaching Te Reo Māori, teaching proper pronunciation. And that just does my heart good because it is a language that sadly was attempted to be wiped out. And I won't say anything about our current government's attempts to minimize it. Oops, sorry, I just did. But yeah. And then the fourth language, for Eliza, was her husband's language, German. And that is another story for another episode. But back to 1840. So the McKenzies and the Frasers and many other people had bought land, so they thought, from a commercial outfit called the New Zealand Company. And they traveled. it must have been a good sell, because they traveled 6 months on a journey, because there was no Suez Canal, there was no Panama Canal in those days. You had to leave Scotland, go to England, and then leave England and go all the way down to the bottom of Africa, Tasmania. There was a number of births and a few deaths on the way. This was a commitment of a lifetime, and there was no going back. There was no going back. And when you buy a piece of land, you imagine that you have certainly bought that piece of land, and yet what was going on in the books of the New Zealand company was that you were buying the right to have one of a set of pieces of land, which sounds like the same thing, but it isn't. In other words, it was more like a certificate. And anyway, long story short, what they were sold was not quite what they were buying. So they arrived in Porneke and Port Nicholson, probably expecting something that was quite set up and already built. But no, they had to do a lot of the work themselves. But what are you going to do? You're going to take a 6 months journey back? There's just no way around it. They had to press through. My question, which I'd love to ask them, and I will never get a chance to, is, did they know about the treaty that was being signed to the north of them? Now, they were quite civically involved and inclined, and it would be quite important for them to know. But I really wonder how much, because this is what I've learned afterwards in my studies, the New Zealand company was moving at their pace, which was fast. They had a commercial imperative. They had to make money. And so they wanted to get people on the ground as soon as possible and into their properties, to show Māori that, yes, there are people who've bought your land, and also to show the British government, we have an operation here, it's real, and more importantly, to get the money in their bank account. Meanwhile, the British were going quite slow. James Stephen was the colonial secretary, and he was an evangelical Christian, and his views meant that his intentions were quite good. Now, what do they say about good intentions? The road to hell is paved with good intentions, because this is the scary part of history. We can achieve terrible things with good intentions. And I'm not saying that James Stephen was particularly culpable for terrible things that happened, but he was the one who sort of conceived of the need of a treaty, which was a comparatively enlightened approach, and yet the intention didn't quite get carried out. So we've got the mindset of my ancestors, who were just really all about themselves. Collectively, yes, but they didn't really have an understanding of this country. They were told a story, they were sold something, and so we can't criticize them too much for being all about themselves. But then they got here and they adapted. They learned the language and the Māori culture, and they identified that they were new people in a new country. So fast forward to, well, not fast forward, let's go up to Waitangi, and let's try to understand the mindset of the Māori rangatira, who are the chiefs who are signing this treaty with this new foreign power. Now, I'm not going to get into all the details, because there are plenty of resources out there to help us understand them. But what I want to reflect on is what I thought the story was growing up, and what I know that it is now. And when I grew up with a convenient fiction, because I was born 50 years ago. I grew up in the 1980s, which was kind of the era of post-racism. Around the world, events as recent as the 1960s were being portrayed as historical events. Martin Luther King, he had a dream. We knew that he had a dream, and we knew that that was about equality and being judged by the content of your character rather than the color of your skin. We knew that he was assassinated, and yet somehow in the 80s, only 20 years after that, there was a sense that that's all in the past. We're all friends now. It's all good. And the same feeling was very strong here in New Zealand, that there was a treaty offered which wasn't offered to other Indigenous people. So yay us, really well done, pat on the back. 2, New Zealand was purported to have the best race relations in the world. And that was a story that we told ourselves and the world for a long time. And when there were protests among Pākehā like myself, there was a bit of an offence. There was a bit of a sense of, well, how ungrateful. And such a terribly self-righteous sense of how dare they disturb our peaceful day. And there was also, and I see this a lot now, there was also a terribly unfair sense of it was the past, get over it. And yet we celebrate Easter, well, that was the past. We commemorate Anzac Day, our Memorial Day, well, that was the past as well. Shouldn't we get over that? No, indeed. So what is it that grievances are about? What is it the protests are about? Well, I'm going to actually read from a relative of mine, and I didn't realize we were relatives until I read this very piece. So David Slack, I haven't asked his prior permission, but this is a published piece of work, so I'm hoping that's okay. So David Slack, in his Substack, which is called Subslack, very good, there was a treaty, there was an understanding, and then there was very little of either, through confiscations, shady dealings, and laws that worked against the interest of Māori. The 66 million acres, I'll just repeat that again, 66 million acres of land that they held in 1840 dwindled to 11,000 by 1890. Imagine that. Imagine that in 50 years, you've lost, I don't know what the percentage is, but that's a ridiculous amount of land to lose. And so just pausing, I started to learn the details of this when I studied law. And I thought, how incredible that I have to do an actual law certificate to learn this. And that it's so different from the very nice, peaceful, resolved, with a bow on it kind of story that I grew up with. So part of the story that I grew up with was that there were land sales. And so the land that I am on, which, by the way, I would just want to acknowledge the mana whenua, the custodians of this land that I'm on right now, Te Kopua Henderson, Te Kaura a Maki, ngā mihi kia koutou. And the land that my ancestors ended up settling in rangatira was from an iwi called Ngāti Awa. So anyway, the reason we acknowledge that is because in many, many cases, the transaction was not tika, to use a Māori word. It was not done right. There was a lot of sometimes legal machination using the law of the colonizers instead of the principles that local Māori people were used to. There was a lot of outright force. Confiscation was a word that was used there. War, invasion to take away land. So much of Te Tiriti was not upheld. And the real crux of it, the key of it, was two different understandings of sovereignty. So when I was doing that first year law course, I was able to read a chapter of a book called The Weeping Waters. Now, the clue is in the title. This is The Weeping Waters, the Treaty of Waitangi and Constitutional Change. Why is it called Weeping Waters? In our Pākehā world, we separate our mind from our heart, for better or worse. In the Māori Indigenous worldview, these things are collective. And that was what hit me, because I realized through my journey of life that I am a holistic, integrated being. Emotions matter. Emotions are a signal of that something is wrong. And so there was a chapter by a professor called Margaret Mutu about what it was like for the actual rangatira signing Te Tiriti o Waitangi. And it was very, very emotional, because what they thought they were signing what they had been verbally explained that they were signing was so different to what happened. And the when you work with people with a different language, you understand that not every word is just immediately correlates with another word in their language. There's overlapping concepts. There's so much that can be lost in translation. And in this crucial treaty that was being signed, that we now put so much weight on, the whole idea of sovereignty was the main contested thing. So Māori had no concept of giving away their sovereignty. There was not. And so it's quite hard to imagine, as some do today, that they were giving that away, because that concept just didn't matter. It just didn't exist. It's like giving away your life. Why would they do that? There's no reason to do that, because they greatly outnumbered the settlers. For them, Te Tiriti was a way to establish some law and order for the Pākehā who were coming here, the settlers, the whalers, the sealers, and the ones like my people who came to build a new life and build a new home. They were not my people, of course, but the sealers and the whalers and the missionaries. They tended to be a little bit unruly. Not so much the missionaries, probably. Actually, in some cases, yes. But there was a sense that we welcome these people here, but can they not look after their own selves, please? And so this was their request to Queen Victoria, can you sort them out? There was never a sense of let's create a whole new entity, a whole new country, and surrender ourselves to you, Queen Victoria. Wasn't the case. And yet that is what many of the Pākehā understood. And that's where our issues exist today. So there's the original intent and spirit of Te Tiriti. There's the actual wording of what it says in Māori and in English. And there's a whole big book that I haven't yet read by a man called Ned, not Ned Flanders. That's the first Ned that comes to mind. But I'll put him in the notes. And it is the history of the English Treaty of Waitangi. He makes the interesting claim, after 7 years of research, it was his PhD paper, that also the British did not intend to take away sovereignty from Māori. So that's really interesting. We've got two documents that actually agree that this country belongs to Māori, and the rest of us live here at their pleasure. This was massive for me at 47 years of age in law school, reading this. And what was really interesting was that I didn't feel threatened by it, because in some countries, this issue would turn into armed warfare, civil war. And we did have we call them the New Zealand Wars in the 1860s. But we don't have that today. We have instead protests. We have instead an attempt to work through due process, because Māori, Polynesian people understand the importance of relationships. And this is what saddens me when I see my people making jabs and criticisms about Māori and about protests and about why they should be grateful and all this kind of ridiculous stuff, because they lost so much. And it doesn't matter that it was a long time ago. This is a culture that is connected to its ancestors and is connected to its land and its collective. And what was lost was not just land, it was a way of life, a way of doing things, and replaced by a legal system, a way of understanding and seeing the world, which is completely different. And so to fit in, to succeed, Māori have to adjust and amend themselves to a system that's from far away. And for me, it helped me to understand my privilege, not so that I could feel sad about it. That's not the end goal. But of course I do feel sad about it, because I know what it's like to be an outsider in other situations. I know what it's like to go to Samoan church and not really understand what's being said and feel ill at ease. And I know what it's like to go to China and not be able to speak the language or read the writing even, and feel like a complete idiot because I don't know what's going on, and try to make progress learning the language and to feel so stupid. That's what we're asking Māori to do in their own country. And through this journey, it just struck me as, how dare we? How could we do this? Because the thing that emboldens us is we don't understand. Or sadly, some do understand, but still feel that it's the right thing to do anyway. That I don't get. Anyway, back to Subslack, because it's not too late. The first people of this land went to court, went to battle, never stopped asserting their rights, but the die was cast. The system of government and justice was set up to fail them. They went from being owners of nearly everything to almost nothing, pushed aside to the margin. Where Māori eventually found themselves in the wake of this deprivation was demoralized and lost. This was the damage of colonization. It was a body blow. People can roll their eyes when you use the word, but that is what it was, and that is what it can do. It can cast the longest of shadows. And now we're talking about the situation today, the underemployment, the undereducation, the incarceration, the adverse health, all of it tracks back to what was done to the first people of the land, pushed to the margin, left to fade from sight. And so in the 1920s, there was a sense that Māori were actually going to go extinct. It was that serious. Population numbers went low. Language was no longer in use. Laws were passed to stop tohunga or spiritual leaders practicing their craft. There was just a sense that this was a dying race. And the crazy thing is that they were still written about and spoken about with such fondness, as if their death was inevitable. And so often people quote Sir Apirana Ngata. He is a great man, and he's on our $50 note. I wish I had a picture of him. I don't carry cash though, but he wrote some things about Te Tiriti back in the 1920s. And it's really important that we know the context in which he was writing. He was writing in the sense of near death of the entire Māori people. And so his position was that sovereignty had been ceded to Queen Victoria. And sometimes people point back to his document as being closer in time to Te Tiriti. Yeah, not quite. Almost a century after. And during a time when there was such a sense of inevitability of Māori decline, that he was grateful. And that's a terrible, low position for people to have to be in. And it's not accurate. Sadly, no matter how well-intentioned, again, he was, it's not accurate. Māori did not cede sovereignty. And it's really sad that his words have been weaponized by people who want to take that sense of deprivation and bring it into the 2020s instead of the 1920s, because Māori are resurgent, they are strong, they are growing in numbers, and they're growing in strength and confidence in their culture. And you know what? As a Pākehā, I have no fear of that, because I've also seen and experienced the great, beautiful things about Māori culture: aroha, love, manakitanga, welcoming. And I know that these are not just surface level. They go deep within the heart of the Māori culture, and they extend out to all with a lot of grace. With a lot of grace. There is such a desire to work through problems, and sometimes that is through very direct words and confrontational words, but it is a desire to work through it, not to use those words to turn people away or to kill people or to push them to the margins, as we just read. So this is the big thing. I've, in my life, had to come through a journey of critically evaluating the world that I grew up in. And the thing with us Pākehā, and I've probably said this before, we don't think we have a culture. We think that our culture is the norm. We think that our culture is the one that scientifically got arrived at as the best, because we tried everything else and we've just come up with what we have. Is that really the case? I think it's done us the opposite. I think our colonized culture has caused us to be unquestioning of the world that we're we grew up in. Because in these early days, the first cracks, so I traced my journey of decolonization, and it's a really long journey. And in the very early days, there was a sense of real discomfort at hearing that the comfortable world that I had thought existed may not be that comfortable after all. And when you don't know much and you're holding on to this much information, that's really scary, because your sense of self is perhaps tied into that identity. That's why a lot of people jealously guard their identity as Kiwis or as New Zealanders. I'll say Kiwis in inverted commas, because I haven't met many Māori that like the use of that word, partly because it's been weaponized against them as well. There was an infamous billboard campaign 20 years ago that pitted Kiwi versus Iwi, really insulting and very divisive. And anyway, so us who are born of settler stock in this country, miles and miles away from our home countries, and yet we're born here. So this is our home country. How do we square that up? Well, that's been the work of a lot of authors over the years. And what I've learned is that it's not something that you do once. You do that work on yourself and you understand it, and then that's ticked off and that's done. It's an ongoing work, and that's okay. That's all good, because that's what everyone else has to do as well. So, digressing a little bit here, my wife and I used to be campus pastors at a church that was mostly Samoan people. And so I would try to get close to the Samoan guys and have conversations with them. And it was actually really hard. There was such and not with everyone, but in the case of some of the guys that I tried to get to relate to, yes, there was the fact that we didn't have that much in common. I didn't know much about sport, had to learn about sport. There was a bit of a language barrier, but also there was the awareness that I'm different from them and that they are trying to look good in the white man's world. And when we talked about work, there was that sense of, trying to live up to these white standards. And I just thought, wow. Because in my ignorance, my first thought was, oh, come on, just be yourself, have confidence. And yet they couldn't. You can't. When the same way that I felt when I was living in China, it's a completely different world, and I've just got to fit in. And I'm thinking about not fitting in all the time. And so that's the case. That's the case of people who don't fit the mainstream norm, i.e. non-white people. They have to think about how to fit in. They have to think about the language that they use. They have to think about how they appear. They have to think about, are they going to be seen as threatening? If you're a guy, if you're tall and you look strong, are you going to be seen as a potential criminal? As a white man, I don't really have to think about that. And that's humbling. So when I started to learn about these things about, I need to think about my cultural identity, my place in history, and the label, Tangata Tiriti, I'm a person of the treaty, I don't feel bad about that. So our Deputy Prime Minister has some issues with that and feels that that's divisive. I don't really get that. Why is that divisive, to own your own identity and your own history and your culture? Why is it divisive to have a label that's made specifically for you, specifically for your situation? Because I'm not European. I've been to Europe now, but for the first 50 years of my life, I've never been to Europe. I speak the languages of Europe. Well, one of them. I experience and enjoy the culture of Europe, but I'm not a European. I'm also not an indigenous New Zealander. I'm a Pākehā. I'm a Tangata Tiriti. And so I've always had that kind of mindset, but it has taken me a while to really understand what that means. And so I just want to share some books with you in case you're reading this, in case you're in case you're watching this, and in case you are wanting to know, how can I spend this weekend? How can I go deeper into this question? But actually first, sorry, interrupting myself. Before we do that, let's go back to Subslack. Okay. So left to fade from sight, is what he was saying. What has been done in the last 40 years, talking present day now, has been intended to restore to men to make possible what was promised at the outset. It's what justice demands. This is the simplest thing. We Kiwis, Pākehā, we say that we have a sense of giving everyone a fair go, and yet we're quite willing to tell people to leave it in the past if it's their grievance and not ours, not my problem. But it is what justice demands. A fair go hasn't been given. It's what justice demands, but it's not only that, it's also promise of something richer for us all. Where do my own forebears sit in that account? And David and I share some forebears there. Compromised? If I were to take the attitude that has been lately asserting itself as this new government turns its back on the good that's been done, I would simply say, not my problem. Get over it. It was forever ago. Stand on your own bloody feet. Or, and I've heard this, all right, you can have your land and none of our inventions. You'll be nothing without us. Or, stop trying to divide us. We're all just New Zealanders. But I can't see it that way at all. Amen, brother David. I look at what got derailed after things had started so fruitfully. I look at what got trampled through greed and indifference. I look at the enduring harm that was done, and I think, why would you not keep working on mending it? Why would we not keep working to restore such a rich and valuable partnership? I hear people say, oh, we gave you all this technology, be grateful crap. And I think, firstly, how much of that did you invent personally, Edison? And secondly, how much opportunity did they have to profit from that when they've been so very comprehensively dispossessed and marginalized? I hear people saying, stop trying to divide us, we're all just New Zealanders. And I don't hear any kind of reasoning. I simply hear people who find the truth to be inconvenient and who can only measure all other lives against their own personal circumstances. Most of all, I wonder how they fail to see the colossal wrong of our colonizing story. You greatly need help. You're very much welcome help. But then once you're okay, you prefer to forget you even needed it. And this point about needing help, in my ancestors' earliest days here, they were totally dependent on local Māori to know where to build their house, how to build their house out of local materials, what to eat, what was safe to eat, what was not. Anyway, you greatly need help. You're very much welcome help. But then once you're okay, you prefer to forget you ever needed it. Who does that? And this is a little bit of a political statement. I think COVID. You greatly needed help. You're very much welcome help. But then once you're okay, you prefer to forget you ever needed it. You maybe even resent it. Yes. And so, grant this is an imperfect comparison, but there's a truth to it that people turn a blind eye to what is not convenient. Let's not be those kind of people. Let's look and not be afraid of looking at ourselves in the mirror. So let me quote again Margaret Wilson in her response to the objection, why are we bothering with all of this? Because it's not too late. This is not ancient lost history. The connection is no more remote than what you can have heard from your own grandmother recounting what she heard from her own grandmother. This is talking about his specific connection to the McKenzies. In the Waitangi tribunal, these accounts have been told over and over. They tell us that so very many wrongs were done and need to be righted. And we see that this began as a rich and fruitful partnership, and that is where we need to be again. The relationship came undone through selfishness and disregard. This new government wants to make this, won't possibly, people are we going to be? So that is a few thoughts from me as a Tangata Tiriti. I mentioned some books. I want to share some things with you. So first of all, I was blessed. This kind of started my family history journey in a way. The fact that as a Mackenzie descendant, I have a book called Pointsfield that was written about the house that was built. That came out about the year I was 1 year old. And so this is a fantastic first cut at a family history. It's got verbatim accounts from my great-great-grandmother who wrote prolifically. And then, so that's the McKenzies. This is the Frasers. This was done 1995, which was the 200th anniversary of the birth of our kind of patriarch there. A bit blurry. Don't be blurry, sir, please. His name's Duncan McKenzie. He was a blacksmith who came also to Wellington. There's another one called Wee Rockles, and there's a whole story behind that. It's a very good story, and it will be a future episode of One Ancestor at a Time. So those are my personal family history bits. Now also, when I was growing up, my dad worked for Wilson and Horton, the printers, And perhaps because of that, we got these facsimile editions of really old books. And they're great. They're really good primary documents. Now, the thing that I learned in fifth form history or sixth form history was a thing called historiography. There's an account of history, and then there's an account about that account, because we are biased. Every single person is biased. So when we look to what we call primary documents, which is documents written at the time, we're still looking through the cultural lens. We're looking through the biases of that person. So these should be read with a sense of curiosity. What were the norms of the time? This is where ChatGPT is really helpful to interrogate those kind of things. So we got narrative of voyage to New Zealand, which is the story of Samuel Marsden, the first kind of missionary who got established in New Zealand. We got station amusements in New Zealand. It's a bit blurry. Auckland, the capital of New Zealand, for about 20 years, Auckland was the capital of New Zealand. So that's a little bit of a tourist guide. Murihuku, which is the name for the South Island, I believe. Old New Zealand. This is fascinating because this was an Irishman who came and assimilated himself into a Māori tribe. So he's a great Irish storyteller, a little bit a roundabout, which is apparently how Irish storytelling is. Stirring times of Te Tiriti, which may or may not be fully true. And this book, I don't know what to feel about this. Our Māoris by Lady Martin. From a 2026 perspective, I look at the title of this book and I go, that arrogance to have a name that suggests ownership. Again, how dare we? And I read a little bit of the book. It's by Lady Martin. Her husband was the first Attorney General, perhaps. Anyway, he was a very important part of the early settlement in Auckland. And she had good relationships with her Māoris. She lived in Judges Bay in Parnell, which is now a super fancy area of Auckland. And she was disabled as well. She needed to be carried around as far as I can remember. But why would she go and call a book Our Māoris? Is that coming from a place of arrogance? No, not knowingly. Not knowingly. Lady Martin was a Christian lady, so she valued humility. It was written from affection, but there's kind of a misplaced affection when you don't think of yourself personally as superior to another person, but you just think of everything about you as superior to them. I'm trying to pass it out. I'm trying to be a bit kind to Lady Martin here, but this is what one of my key messages is about history, the insidiousness of racism, that you don't have to be a really bad racist to be a racist. You just have to have racist views and treat people in a racist way. So yeah, those are some primary document books that are really helpful to understand the times. Really good. Now, modern day books that can help us make sense of it. There are quite a few, and I don't have physical copies of all of them. There's one that I really recommend to you if you are like me and you have a few generations in this land, and that is called Unsettled. It's a collection of stories, but it's compiled by a man called Richard Shaw, and it's a play on words because our ancestors were settler colonizers. And yet the feeling that we get when we start to learn our place in history is unsettled, for sure. And this, sometimes when we're going through this, just as when you discover you have a problem like alcoholism, it helps to get together with other people who have the same problem. We call that Alcoholics Anonymous. And we have a common creed and we talk about our experiences. So similarly, I believe colonization is a bit of a problem like that. It's a multi-generational problem. My ancestors came here believing in their superiority, and it is a mental illness, And I'm still inflicted by that because it's the milieu in which I grew up. But I was somewhat partially inoculated because I grew up in the 80s when we had the Māori Renaissance, and we had the sense that we're all good now. Racism is a thing of the past. And even the movies of the 80s, don't know if you remember The Power of One, about the South Africa apartheid regime, I just created not long after that regime fell, and it portrays the Afrikaners as absolutely hateable. And, there's a lot of films about the Ku Klux Klan, that sort of thing. We can go, those racists are terrible. Those people are bad people because they're racist. What happens when you're a good person and you have good intentions and you are doing, saying, or thinking in a racist way? That's the issue I believe we need to face now. Unsettled, great place to start, especially when you're exploring ancestry and history, because it makes you question all these things about justice. It makes you question how we tell our story. So Pointsfield and Pākehā, these great books about my ancestors, there's what they say and there's the bits that they leave out, because we don't deliberately want to court controversy or anything like that. And so there's actually a whole field of family history called critical family history. Now, it doesn't mean criticizing your family memories. We've all heard that. This is more having a critical view, which just means being curious. It just means being able to see things from a couple of different points of view and not just accepting what we've been told as the only story, but instead having a curiosity. So my curiosity that I'd love to explore and expand on in a very respectful way, because these are my ancestors and I love them. And if you come after them with casting aspersions, I'll be the first to defend them. At the same time, I'm not a whitewasher. I'm not a propagandist either. So that's the line. That's the line we family historians have to travel, is the love of the truth and the love of the people. It's not always obvious how to do that. The best way that I've found is to explain when there are two different versions of a story and go there. So anyway, I have yet to do a lot of digging and a lot of research about my McKenzies and Frasers, but I do have a wealth of stories that they've told me, a wealth of experiences about growing up in that multilingual environment. Not so much about the Gaelic, interestingly, but the English and the Māori. Learning, knowing, living in amongst Māori people, requiring and asking for help from Māori. So there's a pilgrimage that I need to go on, and that is to meet a descendant of, or to somehow mihi to the descendant of Nepia Taratoa, who was a chief who helped my Mackenzie ancestors make their way north when a Pākehā guy who was hired buggered off. So that's a whole story that my great-great-grandmother wrote down. And I'd love to somehow show my gratitude to that Ngāti Toa chief, Nepia Taratoa. But yeah, so Unsettled, great place to start. Another book that I'm in the midst of at the moment, and apologies, I got some cat paw prints on it, but it's Becoming Tangata Tiriti. So this is interesting. So there's Tangata Whenua, which is people of the land, which is Māori. There's Tangata Tiriti, which is all the rest of us. We are all here because that agreement was made 186 years ago today, Te Tiriti o Waitangi. So by default, that's us, right? Kind of. Also, this book suggests that Tangata Tiriti is an active role that we play as we become aware of our role in history, especially for Pākehā like me, who are descended from those original settlers. We have a responsibility. And this is a take it or leave it thing. You may not believe this, that's fine. But this is something that I've realized, that just as almost every other culture in the world has a sense of where you're born, who you're born to matters, and comes with a set of responsibilities. So a good friend of mine probably sees things very different from this. We were in a discussion once and somebody said, well, it's a social contract. And then he said, I didn't sign any social contract. I can understand where he's coming from. I appreciate that, our individuality and our freedom is very important, especially in our culture. And there are things that we receive that we didn't ask for. the love and care of our parents, the nurture, the food we had growing up that enabled us to grow up big and strong. That's part of what we received. And for me, it meant that my ancestors had a place to live for a generation or two, and then we were able to go around and find work, find a living in this land because the system had been built for them. And although I don't inherit land, I don't inherit money from my ancestors back then, I inherit a whole momentum of a system that works for me. And in my day job, I work with people who speak different languages and are often tasked with preserving their language and navigating two languages. And so their parents, their grandparents didn't speak English. And so their experience, their relationship with English is so different. On this journey, I've been finding out that my ancestors spoke English for thousands of years. I know English has changed a lot, and perhaps what you speak 1,000 years ago wouldn't be recognizable today, but my people have evolved with that. And so it's part of me. And that is the system on which things run here. It's mind-blowing. Now, people sometimes talk about white guilt. I don't feel any guilt for all this, but I do feel this sense of responsibility. It's two different things. I wasn't there in 1840 or 1860 when the wars were done, where the land confiscations were done. I didn't exist. I can't possibly feel guilty about it. But I'm a human being with emotions and feelings, so I can feel sad about it. And that's not a bad thing. I guess it's a bad thing if I just felt sad about it and didn't try to do anything about it now. Because that's the thing. These aren't just things isolated that happened in the past. These are very much things that have an effect on the way things are today. So that's the challenge, I guess, of this book, Becoming Tangata Tiriti, and the subtitle says it, working with Māori and trying to find the balance between when to shut up and when to speak up. And that's not easy either, because the very confidence that gets instilled into us from our Pākehā culture is also a double-edged sword, because sometimes we can tend to make ourselves the main thing. That's kind of why I've done this, because the work that we need to do is often with each other. Educating. I don't know if this channel's educating, but inspiring. I want to inspire people to actually dive deep into their culture. And we have a culture as well. We are a unique, distinct people group. And yes, the causes of that were really sad. But we can also, learn about our identity and embrace the skills that we have. White privilege is a real thing. And it's something that I grappled with, because what do we do with it when we realize we're being privileged? How do we turn it around? How do we use it? And ironically, one of the conclusions that I came with is that we should have an attitude of gratitude, not for the injustices which gave us this privilege, but for the fact that we have it as a resource and we can use it. I don't know how other people feel about that. How do you feel about that? But it's like anything else can lead to passivity. It's like, oh, I'm privileged. I'm going to stop using that privilege and not do anything. No. You can't stop being who you are. I can't stop being a white, male, middle-aged person, which puts me in the top percentile of powerful people in the world, believe it or not. I need to use that. As the great Spider-Man said, with great power comes great responsibility. And even in spaces online, there are things that I can say as a bald white man, same hairstyle as our Prime Minister, that other people will get criticized for, but people might hear me out, which is shocking, which is sad. We should hear people's ideas regardless of who they are. And yet we don't. We prejudge. Anyway, so this has been quite a thoughtful reflection. I hope that it gives you fuel for your thoughtful reflection on your place in Aotearoa if you are a New Zealander. And if you are coming from another country, I hope you enjoyed learning about the issues that we face, because the same issues that we have here generally face other settler colonized countries as well. South Africa, Australia, Canada, and the United States all have very similar stories to tell and similar relationships to Indigenous people. There are probably many more, but those are the ones that had the English-speaking people come to colonize them. It is confronting. I have shed tears because it struck me deeply, the injustice of what's happened, and it's just how far embedded the colonial system is, and how hard it is to envision something else. But there is vision out there, and that's the thing. Sometimes when people just see protest, there is a probably quite reasonable response, like, well, what do you want me to do about it? Well, several years ago, there was a consultation around New Zealand that Māori had amongst themselves. What would it look like if we fully honoured the treaty, Te Tiriti or Waitangi? And there was a document created called Matike Mai, which painted a picture of, in my opinion, a very inclusive and beautiful Aotearoa New Zealand. That's the biggest thing. As a Pākehā, I don't have anything to fear. There's not going to be anybody telling me to go back to my home country. There's not anybody going to tell me to stop using my language. This is the fear, because we see other people not as they are. We see them as we are. So when Pākehā fear the protests of Māori, or the plans that Māori might have to reassert and actually honour the treaty, they tend to see it in the way that their ancestors have acted, which is to subjugate, to dominate, to manipulate, using legal structure instead of expensive weapons. It's sad. It's really sad, and I hope that even if it's just one person changes their mind because of the things I put out, then I'm happy. So anyway, I've recommended some resources. I'll put them in the comments. One last thing. I'm not sure if this is an easy book to get hold of. This was given to me by my good friend Alistair. It's called He Tātou Pounamu, the Treaty of Waitangi, a Covenant of Reconciliation. It's very challenging. If you're a Christian like me, this is a very important book to read, because it elevates the Te Tiriti to something that is a covenant, in the same way that the Old and New Testaments are covenants between God and humanity. This is a covenant between two people, and the church plays a role in it. And it's a quick read because it's bilingual. Every left-hand page is in Te Reo Māori, and every right-hand page is in English. So I think I read this in 3 days. Really, really good thinking. It's about Alistair Rees. It's by Alistair Rees, who is a theologian. Real good thinking. There are others. There are other books. Becoming Pākehā is another one that I really recommend. So it's interesting. There was a book called Being Pākehā now in the late 90s by a historian called Michael King. And it's really interesting what's changed between then, the late 90s, and now. I think our sense of progression in Aotearoa was much more progressive back then. The treaty settlements had just started. Iwi were organising and having conversations with the government about how do we make this right. And there was a sense of unity and consensus. And so Michael King's book was called Being Pākehā. In the 2020s, John Bluck's book, and John Bluck was a friend. Was a friend. Michael King passed away. So John Bluck was a friend of Michael King, and so speaks to some of his work. But his book is titled Becoming Pākehā. That's really interesting. Becoming Pākehā and becoming Tangata Tiriti, because there's a sense that there's just what we're born with, but we do have some work to do, some identity work to do. And of course, to do that kind of work, we need to be okay ourselves. We need to be not in survival mode, to be able to think about some of these deep things about how we relate to our fellow human beings. The other thing is, when I grew up, I had so little Māori influence. And that's, I didn't, not even growing up, in the last kind of 20, 30 years, I didn't work in a government department, so I wasn't exposed to much of the education about Te Tiriti. So when we hear things like, we're all New Zealanders now, I was like, yeah, that sounds reasonable, because I had no idea of the Māori perspective. And I'm really grateful for the legal papers and the prescribed readings that I had, which exposed me to a new point of view. And because I'm a human being with compassion, it actually helped me to change my mind. That's what we should do. When something actually gives us a new perspective, we should be able to change our mind. But yeah, I really wish that more people like me, male, pale, stale, could actually open our minds and get into this, because there is such a potentially beautiful future ahead. You know, the protesters aren't wanting to divide. They're wanting to unite, but they are wanting to come to the table as themselves, as Māori, not as New Zealand citizens, but as Māori, as tangata whenua, as the people of this land who have a special relationship with the land. They have a special sort of sense of identity that goes back before 1840. And I just really want to see that honoured. Thank you very much for watching. If you've been watching, don't forget to join our community at oneancestor.co, not .com. Just go to the bottom of the page, pop your name and your email address in, and I will have more goodies and exciting bits of history for you. And I'd love to hear your questions as well and your comments. If you're watching the replay, yeah, just leave me a comment. I'll come back to you. So thank you. This has been One Ancestor at a Time. I am Aotearoa Simon Young. Until next time, haere rā.